Welcome to the Media Navigators podcast, brought to you by the Bloomberg Media Group. My name is Belinda Barker, and I'm the Chief Executive. Earlier this year, we conducted a survey among marketeers about the key trends that they expected across the industry. And audio and podcasting came up as the number one trend expected for growth in the next 18 months. In recent weeks, there have been a number of announcements made by both Apple and Facebook indicating that Silicon Valley are sitting up and paying attention to the phenomena. Many of the members of the Bloomberg Media Group have been extremely successful with their own podcasts. For example, The Daily by the New York Times, which is currently number 2 in the podcasting audiences in the US. Now, the Media Navigators podcast is not designed for mass market. We're unashamedly niche and designed to illuminate key media innovations for marketeers, but do please subscribe and share with your colleagues. So today we're going to be talking about the phenomena of podcasting with Steve Ackerman. Steve is the Chief Content Officer at Somethin Else. Steve has also been, in the past, one of our esteemed judges for the World Media Awards, and I believe at one time was, in fact, a radio presenter. So welcome, Steve. How are you this morning?
I'm very well. Thank you, Belinda.
Steve, would you mind, just for the benefit of the audience, just telling us very quickly what is Somethin Else?
So Somethin Else is Europe's largest independent audio producer. We've got a 30-year heritage, so we've been going for a long time in making audio, and obviously originally that was doing radio shows, and more recently, clearly doing podcasting. We also have a social media studio and a TV studio as well, so we also do other forms of content as well, but the audio bit is our oldest and biggest bit, and as you've rightly said in your intro, particularly with where podcasting is going now, is our fastest growing bit of the business as well.
So the audience is everything about podcasting is growing at a phenomenal rate. I believe when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that now 50% of US households are on a regular basis listening to podcasts. How is that being experienced in other parts of the world?
Well, really, what you see is the audience growth is very aggressive, and you certainly see that in the UK, where every demographic is growing very significantly year on year, even allowing for the past year with the pandemic. And you see that in pretty much every major market to varying degrees. So in other words, there's huge growth going on. That's why you're obviously seeing huge investment going on as well from major organizations, but it's very, very aggressive. Most demographic groups, something like 10 to 20% growth year on year.
So there is a degree, a sense of the whole podcasting being somewhat Wild West. It is to some degree one of the cheaper, low-cost entry for a creator to get into. But does that make it right to enter? And how do marketeers start to get bigger audiences through this medium?
Well, it's definitely true about the Wild West element to the degree that there's a huge amount of investment going on. A lot of companies being bought up, a lot of new entrants into the market. America in particular has seen a lot of activity taking place in terms of producers, production companies being bought or big entertainment groups starting to invest. And that's partly driven by the fact, kind of what we were saying previously, you can see the audience growth, you can see where the medium's going. And therefore there's a strong desire, I think, from a lot of people to make sure they're in at the start, maybe in a way that when there's been previous sort of significant shifts in the way people consume content, maybe previously some historical entertainment companies or big businesses have missed out on some of those opportunities. When you think perhaps what happened with the music industry 20 years ago, or what's happened with on-demand TV and the rise of the SVODs, traditional TV businesses were a bit slow initially. So I think what you see with podcasting is the sort of opposite happening, of, real keenness for lots of companies to embrace that, and therefore really significant investment. In terms of organizations looking to sort of get in at this point, I think even though in theory there's a low barrier to entry, in the sense of obviously audio is a lot cheaper to make than anything you're making for the screen, we're already at the point where program making is at a very sophisticated level. And you can see that from the top shows that get consumed. These are well-made, well-constructed programs that on the whole normally have fairly significant teams behind them, and certainly have good investment going in. And that's as true for a weekly chat show or a daily news show as it is for a high-end narrative series, that an 8-10 part narrative series. So the investment required is significant, and that's because obviously it's so competitive. There are so many people competing for ears that you now need to ensure, if you want to really be in this market, you've got to ensure you are willing to invest to a significant degree.
You mentioned about how some podcast series are now actually being picked up by the TV and the film creative studios in the US. What examples have there been of that?
Well, there's been a lot of examples now. So you can point to shows like Dr. Death or Homecoming, Dirty John. These are all series that have ended up in places like Amazon or Netflix that started life as a podcast series. And
I had no idea.
Yeah. And, really the sort of interesting thing about all of this is it's the first time in the audio industry that IP's had a value, and that being able to, if you come up with an idea, you could, it has a value beyond the original podcast. And so that's driven a really significant market. And it has meant that for the first time, TV and movie producers, in the way that they always would look at books or magazines or newspaper articles as a place to go and option ideas from, they're now looking to podcasts to do the same. And the thing that TV and movie producers like about podcasts, as opposed to newspapers or books, is that the story's already been constructed in a broadcast form and in a narrative form. And so a lot of the groundwork has been done in terms of how you can tell a story to an audience. And so it's definitely something we're seeing as part of our model. We have a number of ideas that are, making their way along the conveyor belt, if you like. We have an agent who represents us in the States selling our ideas. And it's definitely, I think, it's becoming a very key element of the industry at the top end, at the end, the very professionalized end, where you've got serious producers creating shows. It's an important part of the model. So,
okay, if we assume that we've got some brilliant content, brilliant podcast, how do you get your audience? You can't presumably it's not all going to find you instantly.
No, we've definitely, I think, passed the sort of first wave of podcasting where some of the early entrants were able to pick up really significant audiences, and many of those shows have kept those audiences because obviously the loyalty has been built up. It's super, super competitive. These, certainly in 2021, the numbers that constitute a hit, as in the number of listens that constitute a hit, are lower than they would have been 3, 4, 5 years ago, because there's so many more shows out there. There's so much more content out there. And really central around trying to create a show that's a hit is thinking about how that show gets marketed and publicized. It's not really possible, I don't think, or certainly unless you're very lucky, it's not really possible to launch a show and just hope that people are going to discover it, and that you're going to have enough people discover it that's going to create a hit for you. I think for a serious producer, you do need to be thinking about the PR and marketing, and some of that will be paid spend as well as just organic activity that needs to take place around the podcast to let listeners know. And obviously for someone like us who have a network of shows, we have the advantage of being able to cross promote from one show to another, and that's quite a key part of our model. And we're within. We have a JV with Sony, so we're within the Sony family, and so we benefit from that to a wider extent as well from other Sony shows as well.
So if you, from a marketeer's point of view, who's never been in the audio space at all, there are two approaches they can take. One is placing spots within top selling shows in the same way as you would do on a TV broadcast, and then creating your own podcast. I guess it would be interesting to know when you would advise one approach versus the other, and then also how is it the advertising perspective, how is it measured or monitored at the moment? If I've got a spot on TV, I know how that's going to be measured and delivered. If I've got banners or digitally, that's measured. And how is it done for podcasting?
Well, the measurement is in impressions, is in listens. So to the exact listen, we can show how many people have listened to the show that your host read or advertisement is on, and that's in effect the metric that's being bought on a CPM basis. So exactly the same as radio or TV advertising. There's a CPM, and you pay that according to how many people you're gonna hit. In terms of your sort of first question about when to decide whether you take more of a paid advertising route or whether you take a route where you're creating your own content, I think that very much depends on from a marketing perspective what the brand is looking to achieve. I mean, clearly creating your own content can create a much deeper level of engagement. The flip side is that needs to be done to a really high standard, because from a listener's perspective, whether you're a brand creating a show or whether you're someone like us creating a show, it's just a show, right? You're still competing for the same ears. And when you're a marketeer creating a show, you are competing against the best producers in the world. And so you've got to ensure that your production is right up there with the best producers in the world. And I think what you often see is an assumption that because the cost of entry is quite low, that, oh yeah, we'll just get our chief exec to host a few interviews and that'll work. And we've seen this so many times where frankly we get briefs coming to us and it is that the brand is sort of saying, oh yeah, we've got this great guy in the office who's sort of we think would be a great host, and we just say, look, that's not a project we can do because we just don't think it's going to work. If you want, you wouldn't get some bloke in the office to go and paint your billboard for you. Or to pick up his phone and make a TV ad for you. So why do you think that's going to work in the audio space? If you're going to engage people, do it properly and actually treat the audience with a bit of respect, rather than thinking that you can just knock out something cheap and they're gonna go for it.
We talked earlier, and sorry, kind of slightly jumping back on the demographic of the audiences. How is that changing, and is that measurable in any way? Because obviously podcasting started as more of a youth trend. Not sure that's quite the right term, but you know what I mean. And even people as old as I am are now listening to podcasts. How is that going, and how are you able to target against audiences?
So actually, it didn't necessarily start as a youth trend. It started more in that middle group of sort of 25 to 45-year-olds, sort of affluent, ABC One types. I mean, that was the initial reason why Apple became such a central place, because initially there was a disproportionate amount of, if you were an Apple device owner, you were more likely to be a podcast listener originally than if you were an Android owner. It's not so true now. But then what we saw sort of 3, 4, 5 years ago was the younger demographic really started to grow significantly, and then obviously in more recent years, what's come on board is the older demographic, and it's interesting because it really does mirror to some degree the sort of pattern of behavior we saw with the growth of the SVODs, where obviously the older demographic are the last to sort of get their heads around what it means to use Netflix or Amazon. But once they do, they really do. And you see the same pattern of behavior in terms of audio. So once listeners embrace the on-demand habit, they really embrace it. They become quite voracious in their listening. And certainly if you become a weekly podcast listener, in the UK, you're probably listening to at least 5 or 6 podcasts a week. In the US, it's slightly higher because commute times and travel times are obviously longer. And so, you become quite a voracious consumer. And so that's what's driving that sort of growth to quite a significant degree. In terms of targeting, so we are able to see the demographics to some degree of who listens to our shows, depending on which platform they're listening. And so there is some information, therefore, that can obviously be shared with advertisers, both from a male-female perspective and also an age demographic perspective, and especially a location perspective, where we can be really, really specific. So, we know to the exact town where people are listening in terms of each of our shows.
Okay, interesting. And over the next 12 months, putting your kind of crystal ball out, how do you see it continuing to grow? Where do you see the changes happening?
Well, I think there's always been a common line talked about in the UK about the UK being 2 to 3 years behind the States in terms of the podcast industry. And I think that's probably right. And so we're just starting to see a tipping point now where more significant investment is coming into the UK industry. There's more startups, more startup producers coming in. I think organizations such as established media organizations are now really embracing podcasting and making sure they get proper teams in place and sort of are investing in the infrastructure that they need. And so I think we'll continue to see an acceleration of that, but also we'll start to see, I think, more of the bigger media and entertainment beasts in the UK getting involved in podcasting in exactly the same way as we've seen in the States with big TV producers and big news organizations like the New York Times. We do have it to a degree here. Obviously, The Guardian have invested fairly significantly. News UK have invested fairly significantly. But we haven't seen a huge amount of companies in the TV space yet investing. There are a few. Fremantle are definitely one of those. So I think we'll start to see a lot more of that.
Are media agencies getting into buying on behalf of their clients, or are they even recommending advertising in the audio space?
Yeah, very much depends agency to agency, which is, I guess, kind of what you'd expect. That's sort of a truism, isn't it? You get some media agencies who absolutely get this and are spending, and also are looking at either funding shows on behalf of their clients or obviously are taking briefs from clients more with a marketing objective. So, for instance, Dentsu have Storylab, and Storylab have been funding original productions, nothing to do with brand clients. They've been funding productions back to that IP model that shows that can then be sold into IP. We've seen plenty of brands very keen to create their own shows. I mean, we're lucky enough to have to sort of done some of those productions with people like Chanel or Lucozade or Red Bull. These are all brands who've invested sort of fairly significant amounts into making really good sounding shows. And we do see, yes, media agencies investing on the advertising side. Obviously, the shows we create ourselves, that's how they're funded. They're funded by advertising. And so we do see lots of media agencies taking that up. I think there are still plenty of media agencies who don't quite get it still or haven't quite embraced it. But that's to be expected on, I guess, what is a fairly new medium still.
Yeah. And are there signs of there being either, developing your own regulatory body or IPA or IAB or one of the myriad of other regulatory bodies taking an interest in this area?
Well, the IAB already does. So they take an interest in the area in the sense of they're already running a few times a year upfronts around podcasts, where podcast producers can obviously showcase the shows they've got coming up to the advertising community or to the agency community. I mean, in terms of regulation, in a way, the joy about podcasting is it's obviously considered as the internet, so it falls outside of Ofcom. Obviously, you have to follow the sort of legal, the laws of the land. But in that sense, there's much greater creative freedom than if necessarily you were making a show that would sit on, commercial radio or on the BBC. And pretty similar from an advertising perspective, obviously, a need to follow the laws of the land. But I'm not sure at the moment there seems much indication that there's necessarily a need to sort of create much more than is already in existence.
I just wondered, I guess, whether more marketeers would trust, feel inclined to be putting more of their budgets into audio if they felt it was a more regulated market. But I think at the moment it certainly, if our survey of marketeers was true, they all appear to want to be investing. So clearly I'm wrong.
Well, I think, one of the drivers around that, I was, as someone who's been an audio veteran for many, many years, I used to get very, very frustrated that sort of radio wasn't quite embraced in the way, I thought it should be. And part of the driver I always thought for some of that was that, frankly, you had a lot of folks in media agencies who weren't necessarily listeners to commercial radio. Understandably, they were listening to BBC radio stations or not listening at all, listening to their own stuff. And what you see with podcasting is, part of the reason people get it is because they're consumers as well. We all know that, if senior marketeers at top places are listening to podcasts and saying, oh, I'd like to be involved in that space. And the same with folks at media agencies. So it's something that's sort of penetrated on every level, and that helps in the sell. It basically helps people to understand the medium and to get it.
You mentioned, we talked earlier about subscription models and how that was going to have an impact. Could you just elucidate a little bit on that, how that's going to change things over the next 12 months?
Yeah, so Apple have just announced the launch of Apple Podcast subscriptions, and we're very lucky to be someone who's sort of collaborating from the start on that. And what that means is any podcast can have the ability to still do as it does now, to be available freely on every platform, but it can also have the ability on Apple to offer a subscription route. So what that would mean certainly for the podcasts we release, that are going out to the public, it gives us the option, for instance, to say to listeners, if you'd like to listen to this podcast ad-free, or if you'd like to hear exclusive extra content, or if you'd like to potentially, it could be things like, if you want to be the first to hear the new season, subscribe. And those will probably be payments of somewhere like $2.99, $3.99 a month, something in that sort of region. And really, in effect, it starts to move podcasting much more to a freemium model, where obviously the majority of people will continue to receive their podcasts for free, and those podcasts will be funded through advertising. But there'll be a small group who will want to pay because they feel part of that community, or because they feel very engaged with that podcast. And in effect, that opens up a very potentially new significant revenue stream for podcasting. And the challenge for podcasting as a new content medium has been that it's only the top few percent of podcasts that have been able to make money. And so that obviously, that idea that it throws open a potential new revenue stream, and particularly if you have a very sort of loyal, dedicated listener base, it also works the other way. It means if you're a very small niche podcast, but you've got a very small engaged base, that might generate enough money for you to do your podcast, maybe even without necessarily going down an advertising route. So it's a really interesting move. Spotify are also going to be doing the same thing, and frankly, between Apple and Spotify, they are the two big players in terms of listens. So getting those guys on board for that is really important.
But you can see not just the entertainment shows, but I could see why kind of like the member brands of the World Media Group, the likes of the Financial Times, New York Times, whatever, that they would be able to produce the type of content that people would be willing to pay for.
Absolutely. And the interesting option that you have, certainly with Apple subscriptions, is the ability to either offer a show individually for a listener to subscribe to, but you can group all of your shows into what they're calling a channel. So in other words, you could have the Financial Times channel, and you pay an amount that just gives you everything the Financial Times do. And clearly that's sort of quite consistent with the paywall model that lots of newspaper groups have already done. So, you know, it's going to be very interesting. I think everyone's going to be trying to figure it out as they go along. It launches next month in May. And so, you know, I'm very excited to see how it develops, and it's certainly something we're going to be embracing. We're going to be, you know, launching with a number of shows and basically seeing how the audience reacts to that.
Brilliant. That's been really interesting. And I'd just like to, one last question is just, if a marketeer who's never put their toe in this marketplace before, do you have one top tip for them to think about?
I would say think about the audience. Put the audience first. Whether you're advertising or whether you're creating your own show, the wonderful thing on the advertising side is actually the most popular form of advertising are the host reads. So the reads done by the actual presenter, which is a different form of advertising than, say, a spot ad. It's a much more engaging form of advertising. And the same with, obviously, if you're creating your own show, it's much more engaging. So I think really about the audience, because podcasting, its real beauty and the reason why it's driven so quickly is its intimacy. It is a really engaging, lean in, intimate experience. You know, you are literally going into someone's head and they are listening very carefully to what you do in a way that's much more engaging than actually seeing something on a screen where, you know, your brain relaxes to a much greater degree. So thinking about the audience and ensuring that you can engage them or entertain them is, I think, really, really crucial.
You think back however many years ago when they were saying about, you know, TV killing the radio. I'm not saying that this is going to kill TV, but it is kind of nice to feel audio coming back in the way it is. Anyway, I'd just really like to thank you, Steve. That's been really interesting, very helpful, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Belinda. Bye.
Bye. The World Media Group is an alliance of leading international media organisations that connects brands with highly engaged, influential audiences in the context of trusted and renowned journalism. I'm delighted to have as members The Atlantic, BBC News Global, Bloomberg Media, Business Insider, The Economist, Forbes, Fortune, Financial Times, National Geographic, New York Times, Reuters, Time Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. It is a great honour to work with all of them. Thank you.